The fact that much of the work of government is directly controlled by British boardrooms rather than the average citizen is galling enough for any real democrat. But the savage world of 21st century capitalism has enormously compounded the problem. Government contracts favouring particular companies and restrictive laws drafted to suit particular conglomerates are just two of the more obvious side products of the cash for honours trade. This feature of our so-called democracy briefly made the news in January 2009, when two members of the House of Lords freely admitted they had accepted payments from corporations in return for particular amendments to legislation, and another two owned up to a brace of undercover reporters that they would cheerfully do so if they had the chance. If this problem was a uniquely British one, it would stand a reasonable chance of a uniquely British solution. But it's no longer that easy. Foreign companies have also been muscling in to get their noses into the trough. The unimaginably wealthy American and European conglomerates have infiltrated British government by the very simple and ancient technique of bribery. They simply pay the bulk of the cost of the election campaigns of chosen political parties and individuals within those parties. As well as funding election campaigns, there are also suspiciously close connections between some very powerful politicians and very powerful corporations, such as the link between Tony Blair, say, and JP Morgan, or Dick Cheney and Halliburton. The professional lobbying industry provides the lines of communication between the international business community and the political decision makers. Politicians bought in this way, which is most of the powerful ones, are permanently bombarded by the corporate sponsors of election campaigns to award juicy government contracts to those sponsors, as well as to either scrap interfering laws or pass favourable legislation guaranteeing the rights of political donors to behave like legalised gangsters. In 2006, the Canadian writer Paul Bigioni exposed another very sinister development in the corporate business world's struggle to destroy democracy, which bypasses the lobbyists altogether so that the ultra-rich can meet directly and secretly with elected politicians. The virtually unknown North American Competitiveness Council, NACC, is a fine example of the almost terminal seriousness of this situation. Born in June 2006, the NACC comprises 10 business leaders from each of Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and its declared purpose is supposedly to advise governments on improving the competitiveness of North American business in global markets. Its elite membership is exclusively from the world of corporate business and deliberately excludes consumer, labour and environmental groups, as well as small business interests. The three governments each assign 3 high-level ministers. In the case of the United States, it was the Secretaries of State, Commerce and Homeland Security. These meetings are supposed to happen 3 times a year, so these powerful business leaders can supposedly help to provide policy input. In other words, it's a secretive communications channel between the world of big business and those we trust to look after us. The conflict of interest is obvious. On the one side of the table sit corporate executives who are legally mandated to maximize profit for themselves, and on the other side sit the people whose election campaigns are paid for by those executives and whose future careers may be determined by those executives. I wonder whose interests are of more interest to these politicians, the ordinary voter or the corporate executive. The NACC is far from being the first or only cosy little club where the rich and powerful leaders of the business world meet in total secrecy with those we trust to govern our countries and our best interests. There's also the immensely powerful and secretive Bilderberg Group, for example, which has been around for over half a century. And there's also the innocuous-sounding Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. Although these two organisations sound like they might be government departments, they are in fact highly secretive clubs where the 1% of the 1% manipulate the world. Because of their highly secret nature, very little of what they do is exposed to public glare, but very occasionally a tantalising glimpse of what they're really all about does get revealed. David Rockefeller, for example, once head of Chase Manhattan Bank, and who was one of the founders of the Trilateral Commission, was recently quoted as saying the following: "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected the promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the bright lights of publicity during those years. The insidious and sinister control that big corporations have over supposedly democratic countries probably reached crisis point a couple of decades ago. George Monbiot tells in his superb book how, in 1997, an outrageous attempt was made by the trusted leaders of Western governments to draft an international trade agreement called the Multilateral Agreement on Investment, or MAI. No doubt, these fine trusted leaders were being severely manipulated by groups such as Bilderberg and the Trilateral Commission. MAI was an outrageous attempt to legitimize the power of corporations over national governments, and would have allowed corporations to not only prevent governments passing legislation to protect their own citizens, but would also have given corporations the legal power to extort money from governments. This scandalous assault on democracy very nearly succeeded in becoming international law. Certainly the British government was fully supportive of it. It was only the French who strongly objected, fearing, and rightly so, the agreement would have seriously threatened the French film industry. The MAI failed to be adopted in 1997, thanks to French intransigence. However, the people that promote these evil proposals are not easily deflected from their purpose. As I write these words, the MAI has been reborn as something called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP for short. TTIP would effectively provide the lawful right for giant corporations to take over the economies of the countries that are partners to the agreement, most of Europe, in other words. These corporations already have full control of the United States, and they also have de facto control in Europe too, but TTIP would further legitimize and consolidate their grip on European democracies, and provide the authority for them to lawfully crush any popular resistance to their control. Furthermore, TTIP has an ugly sister, which is in a similar stage of gestation, called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Where TTIP is an attempt to control transatlantic trade between Europe and the United States, the TPP is an attempt to control trans-Pacific trade between Asia and the United States. It's very obvious that the common factor in both of these plans is the United States, which would become the geographical center of a global trading cartel controlled wholly by corporations. The fact that the outrageous scandal that was the MAI proposal in 1997 escaped the attention of most citizens at the same time escaped the attention of most citizens at that time was due to a complicit media, as David Rockefeller pointed out. A media which is itself largely controlled by a handful of powerful corporations. And the fact that similar scandals such as TTIP and TTP are still unfolding in virtual secrecy within the hushed corridors of power every single day is a legitimate concern to be directed to every news editor in the world. The first time most people realized something strange might be happening in the highly secretive world of global economics occurred in Seattle in 1999, when the whole city was shut down by anti-globalization protesters demonstrating about a meeting there of the World Trade Organization. The film about that event, Battle in Seattle, is a magnificent and uplifting story that should be shown on TV every year at Christmas. Ever since then, it has become impossible for those who run the world's economy to meet up without the protection of an army of militarized police. These people need all this protection because what they're doing is nothing short of committing massive global crimes. And it's perfectly reasonable that the 99% should be on the streets protesting against them. These sinister organizations are exactly like the mafia, but not as open and honest, and much, much more powerful and deadly. The Great Battle in Seattle showed, not for the first time, mass student demonstrators doing what we foolishly trust and expect the media to do, alerting the trusting, snoozing citizenry to the political chicanery of their own great trusted leaders. This is a fairly new and very dangerous escalation of the deterioration of the feeble and sickly patient that represents democracy. It's very easy to see how the corporate business world has now secured for itself a direct line into the corridors of power. Hugely powerful, secretive and unaccountable organizations such as the NACC, Bilderberg, Council on Foreign Relations and Trilateral Commission are regularly meeting in secret with some of the most powerful political decision makers in the world to tell them what decisions to make and what laws to pass or to scrap. Whole books are rightly dedicated to this enormous topic, and I've not even begun to scratch the surface. I only wish to point out to the unsuspecting student, who is, quite understandably, unfamiliar with this murky material, that most supposedly democratic governments are now all but totally controlled by the boardrooms of unaccountable international conglomerates, all relentlessly beavering away at their legally defined mandates to pursue relentlessly and without exception their own self-interest. The evidence is abundant and compelling, and any doubter of this fact is strongly encouraged to browse through the many excellent sources of proof, only some of which have been mentioned here. The control of government by corporations is clearly unacceptable in any country that aspires to be a democracy, but that's exactly what we have. All of our most powerful political decision makers are significantly and often directly controlled by corporations, not us. Corporations that are legally required to maximize profits for themselves. But corporations cannot operate without the legal authority to do so, an authority which can only be granted by the state. As Joel Bacon says, without the state, the corporation is nothing, literally nothing. The next vital point to grasp is that the state cannot operate for long without the moral authority of the people. So to add another piece to Mr. Bacon's argument, without the people, the state is nothing, literally nothing. Mr. Bacon kindly provides a nice reinforcement of this view from Oscar Oliveira, a trade union official who helped the Bolivian people overcome the immense power of state and corporation, in this case a subsidiary of Bechtel no less. Mr. Oliveira said, "Democracy is about who makes decisions. The only sovereign is the people, and no one else." The defeat of the Bolivian government and Bechtel by the Bolivian people acting together proves his point. Most of the history of human society reveals a never-ending conflict between those who should have decision-making power, ordinary people, the 99%, and those who do have decision-making power, the kings and queens, generals and bankers, the 1%. The 1% don't care about the injustice of the situation. They never have, and they never will. That's for the fairly obvious reason that as far as the 1% are concerned, this is the age-old, tried and tested method of providing them with limitless power and wealth, and therefore they have no wish to change it. However, as far as the rest of humanity is concerned, the 99%, and for all of Earth's other living creatures and the planet's suffering environment, the monstrous and numerous injustices caused by the tyranny of the 1% is truly catastrophic. Nothing better illustrates how the system works than the tight relationship between the corporate business world and the so-called security forces and our political decision makers, the leaders of which groups together comprise the 1%. The corporate business world routinely bribes our political decision makers to make the decisions that will enrich corporate boardrooms and impoverish the rest of the world. There is routine toing and froing of personnel between corporate boardrooms and parliamentary chambers through what is well known and widely recognized as the revolving doors of power. The thing is obviously corrupt and wrong, and when we consider the consequences of the system in terms of permanent war, the endless suffering of millions of people, and the catastrophic irreversible destruction of our planet's environment, it's plain to see that it's not only wrong, it's downright evil. It doesn't have to be this way. It's not the same kind of natural disaster as an earthquake or a tsunami, for example. This horror exists for one reason, and one reason only. It exists because the 1% want it to exist. The 1% will never change it. Only we, the 99%, can do that.